everybody. Welcome back to the Dr. Jocker's Functional Nutrition Podcast. And you guys know that one of my favorite topics to talk about is blood sugar, insulin, and metabolic health. And we had a great interview recently with Dr. Ben Bickman, where we went in depth on that. And this is almost like a follow-up to it, because we're going to talk about really the personalized approach to really looking at your blood sugar and how it's responding to the foods that you're consuming. And so my guest is Dr. Casey Means. She is the Chief Medical Officer at Levels, and she is a Stanford-trained physician. Again, Chief Medical Officer and co-founder of the metabolic health company Levels, and she's the Associate Editor of the International Journal of Disease Reversal and Prevention. And you can find more information about her at levelshealth.com. And we're going to talk about what the best foods are for blood sugar management, for metabolic health, and how that could be variable depending on how your body's responding to the foods that you consume. We're going to talk about personalized medicine. So, Dr. Casey, thanks for joining us here.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Jockers. So happy to be here.
Well, yes, for sure. And I've heard of several of your interviews on other podcasts, and you really do a great job of explaining how important blood sugar stability is. And, you know, this new technology that we have now, continuous blood glucose monitoring. And so what I'd love to do is start with your story and, you know, how you went from Stanford and trained in medicine to now kind of branching out into functional nutrition, integrative medicine approach.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you mentioned, I trained as a medical doctor, conventional medicine. I trained at Stanford, did my undergrad in medical school there. And then I went on to become a head and neck surgeon. So I was deep in the surgical world for about 5 years. And in my role as a head and neck surgeon, which is really treating the conditions of the ear, nose, and throat, so an ENT surgeon, something I noticed was sort of hitting me head on, after about 5 years, like, wow, pretty much all of the conditions that I'm treating are inflammatory in nature. They're all related in some way to chronic inflammation. So some of the things you think about are like sinusitis, which is inflammation of the sinuses, and chronic ear disease, which is inflammation of the eustachian tube, the tube that connects the nose to the ear. You get, inflammation in that tube, and you get pus building up in the ear. You've got Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is inflammation of the thyroid. You've got things like vocal cord granulomas, which are inflammatory masses of the vocal cords. And then lots of head and neck cancer, of course, which we know cancer has very much a relationship between chronic inflammation. So it was really interesting to me to sort of step back and say, wow, this is sort of a very common theme between a lot of the conditions that I'm treating. And in some way, it didn't make total sense to me that we would be treating those conditions with surgery, because chronic inflammation is fundamentally an issue with how our immune system is responding to perceived or real threats in the environment, in our bodies. And, more and more we're learning about how chronic inflammation is in many ways really rooted in our everyday exposures. So what we eat, the toxins we're exposed to in our food, air, and water, how much sleep we get, the stress in our lives, how much or how little exercise we're getting, our microbiome, all of these things have a direct relationship to chronic inflammation. So treating it with this sort of very reactionary, invasive, more anatomic approach with surgery, there was some sort of missing link there. And certainly surgeries are really important and beautiful art. But for some of the conditions really rooted in chronic inflammation, it kind of got me thinking there might be a better way to approach this. What could we be doing with sort of really personalized dietary and lifestyle interventions, really foundational help to really quell that chronic immune response, quell that threat the body is sensing, and potentially keep patients out of the operating room? You're not going to prevent all surgeries, but I certainly think there's some low-hanging fruit we could do to help people minimize the severity of their diseases and hopefully never have them get to that really end of the line where they see me in the OR going under the knife, which is a really serious thing. So that really got me on this journey of trying to understand the root causes of disease. And that led me to functional medicine. And so I actually stepped away from the operating room, got training with Institute for Functional Medicine, and really started thinking of disease a lot differently. I started seeing things much more as symptoms and diseases often being the branches on a very similar tree. And that tree that sort of root that connects a lot of seemingly disparate diseases often comes down to things like inflammation, and even deeper than inflammation, metabolic dysfunction. This was talked about so beautifully on your episode recently with Dr. Ben Bickman, who was talking about metabolic dysfunction and insulin resistance. But what's so interesting is that, in our country, it's thought that about 88% of Americans have signs of metabolic dysfunction. That was shown in a study a couple of years ago from UNC, that 88% of adult Americans have at least one biomarker of metabolic dysfunction. And metabolic dysfunction and insulin resistance, which are kind of two sides of the same coin, really can directly feed into inflammation. So it's all really related. And what's sort of hopeful about this is that those are things that are readily modifiable with smart choices in how we live and what we expose ourselves to. So became really interested in that, and really this systems and network biology movement, which is really stepping back and saying, we've conventionally looked at diseases in conventional medicine as isolated silos. You've got depression, you've got obesity, you've got diabetes, you've got prostate cancer, you've got IBS, and that these are all things that are different, and we treat them separately with medications with totally different mechanisms. But when you step back and you use sort of more advanced research techniques like whole genome sequencing and proteomics, how can we actually see what are the molecular links between diseases? And you create a web, a network, a system, and that's really the root of systems and network biology. And when you start doing that, you see these connections. And I think the future of medicine is really treating conditions at that level, at the connections between diseases. Because when you do that, you can, hit a lot more birds with one stone. That's sort of a negative metaphor, but you know what I mean? It's got, instead of playing whack-a-mole, you can have multifarious effects with some single interventions that affect that root cause physiology. So my career really moved in that direction. How can we help people understand what ties their symptoms and conditions together on a root cause? And then how can we help inspire people and enable people to make the choices day in, day out, the personalized choices for their body that actually move the needle on that sort of fundamental molecular biology? And that comes down to a lot of the principles that we all know. How we eat, how we sleep, how we exercise, how we stress, what we expose ourselves to in the environment. These translate in our bodies into molecular information that guides our physiology. And so I'm really passionate about creating tools like what we're doing with my company Levels to help people understand their body and make those decisions day in and day out that move the needle on core physiology.
Yeah, it's so good. And it's amazing to think 88%, so it's 9 out of 10 people are dealing with some sort of metabolic dysfunction that's going on. And the way that we react to stress, really, we all kind of our physiology reacts to stress the same. However, we can have a unique genetic expression. So it's kind of like you're saying, like there might be, same underlying factors behind why somebody might have Hashimoto's thyroiditis and somebody else might have eczema. And so, it doesn't mean that those diseases are totally different. There's a lot of similarity and overlap, and some of the same factors like blood sugar instability might be at the core there. And so that's kind of what you're talking about, tying that together and going upstream and finding root cause factors.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, I think Ben described this really well on the podcast. Something like a core root cause dysfunction in the body, like blood sugar dysregulation and resultant insulin resistance, that doesn't live in one little part of the body. It doesn't live in a small box in the body. It lives everywhere. We are a unified system, connected by our circulation, by everything. And so, things aren't sequestered to one small area. So that insulin resistance and the fact that the body has to produce more insulin to basically get the signal to the cells, that's being heard by every cell in the body. And so while in one person that may show up as polycystic ovarian syndrome, and another person that might show up as Alzheimer's, and in another person it might show up as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, in another person it's hypertension, in another person it could be a more aggressive cancer. Like these things they seem so different, but I think stepping back and really thinking about the body, all parts of the body hearing this, but in some people where that is expressed, where that becomes pathology, is going to look a little bit different based on our unique characteristics. And if it's the ovaries that happen to be more sensitive to that insulin resistance, PCOS, if it's the brain insulin resistance, neurodegeneration. So I think it's a really, it's a whole new way of kind of looking at things. And I think there's certainly a lot of movement in books like, Why We Get Sick and and others are really helping to reframe our perspective about why we have to think about some of these things like, blood sugar, even if we're not diabetic, well before we get to that advanced disease state, because even in those earlier stages, even when we're quote unquote normal with our fasting blood sugar, there's still probably a lot of optimization we could do to just sort of help, our entire bodies thrive a bit more.
Right. Absolutely. So, my health coaches and I, when we're looking at blood work, right, somebody goes in, they do a fasting blood work in the morning, and typically major markers we're looking at are fasting glucose, fasting insulin levels, hemoglobin A1C, fructosamine, right? And they kind of give us an idea of what's happening in a point of time. However, with what you guys are using with the continuous blood glucose, it's really looking at what's happening all the time. Like you're continuously can monitor it, how your body's responding to momentary stress, food that you're consuming, things like that. Can you talk more about that and how that compares to testing on just a standard blood lab like we talked about?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd say the labs you're ordering are amazing and definitely more thorough than what the average doctor or average patient is going to get when they walk into the doctor's office. I mean, merely adding a fasting insulin is giving you, 10x the information that just a fasting glucose is doing. And so I think that can be extremely helpful to start painting the picture of where people really stand on the metabolic health spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And, but I think, there's this really exciting new wave of diagnostics and monitoring tools that are continuous in nature. So traditionally we've had these one-time point measurements for lab testing, like hemoglobin A1C. You get your blood drawn, it tells you about a 3-month average of your glucose levels. You get a fasting glucose. That's just a one-time measurement of what your morning glucose is. And by nature of actually just getting that test one time, it almost leads us to believe that number is fairly static, when in fact, fasting glucose can bounce around a lot day to day. And so, but it kind of primes us to think, oh yeah, this is my fasting glucose. This is who I am in terms of my glucose. It's not true. It bounces around day to day based on the choices we're making every day. And then what's more, after you get that morning fasting glucose, your glucose is going up and down, potentially on a roller coaster throughout the entire 24 hours, which has a huge implication on health. And that's what you can't pick up with these one-time lab draws. So continuous monitors, like a continuous glucose monitor, totally open up this whole new world of data that can be really useful and really actionable to people. So just to step back on what a continuous glucose monitor is. So it's a wearable sensor, in the same vein as something like, a Fitbit or a Whoop. You wear it on your body 24 hours a day, and it's giving you a continuous data stream of your glucose levels 24 hours a day. And it's doing that. You wear this on the back of the arm. It's about the size of a quarter. It sticks with an adhesive, and there's a small 4mm probe that's like a piece of almost like dental floss, just 4mm, that goes under the skin painlessly. And it's sensing glucose in the background every 15 minutes and then sending that information to your smartphone. And with that, as opposed to one glucose measurement a year, you're getting like you can get, up to 100 or more time points of glucose per day and see a real curve of what's happening. And why that's important is because, first of all, for a metric like fasting glucose, you can see how it changes day to day. You can see how if you eat, a high carbohydrate meal at night, your fasting glucose could be 5 or 10 points higher the next morning. You can see after a meal in the middle of the day, whether your glucose, spikes up to a really high level or just stays pretty flat. You can see how exercise impacts your glucose and your response to meals. You can see how something like stress, a stressful phone call, or, a stressful conversation with a friend, how that affects your glucose. You can also see, how a poor night of sleep or a really good night of sleep affects your fasting glucose. So really dynamically understanding how your behaviors are affecting glucose. And the other reason it's quite important is because it measures glycemic variability. So glycemic variability is essentially how spiky your glucose is throughout the day. Really, for optimal health, we want to probably have flat and low glucose levels, maybe gentle rolling hills up and down as the glucose rises a little bit after a meal and comes down. But we do not want sharp peaks and valleys, stalagmites and stalactites. Yeah. We don't want that. That's bad for health. When that's happening, when you have high glycemic variability, you know that a few things are happening. One, high glucose is going to trigger inflammation. It's going to trigger oxidative stress. It can trigger the process of glycation, which is where high glucose in the blood causes glucose molecules to stick to different things in the body, like proteins, and potentially cause dysfunction in how these proteins work. So alone, glucose can cause those processes: inflammation, oxidative stress, glycation. But it's also, of course, going to be stimulating the pancreas to make insulin and to produce more insulin, like Ben talked about on his episode. And when that happens, that's a normal process. Your glucose goes up, your pancreas makes insulin, the insulin allows you to take glucose up into the cells. But when that's happening all the time, when you have high glycemic variability, means you're spiking over and over and over again, multiple times per day, maybe because you've been told to have snacks many times throughout the day, which was common recommendations in the past. Your insulin is constantly going to be peaking. And what that's telling to your body, that is molecular inflammation to your body for every single cell, that it's essentially turning on the pathways that insulin turns on, which is, a lot of vital pathways, but when they go on overdrive, it can be a problem. It's a pro-growth signal. And you just don't want it to be on all the time. It's a fat storage signal. It tells your cells to take excess glucose and put it into fat in the cells. It stops you from burning fat. It also makes your cells insulin resistant. And so when that signal of insulin is being constantly triggered, our cells get a little confused. They're like, why is there so much insulin around? And they actually kind of put on the brake and they say, this is too much. We can't take in all these substrates. Let's slow down the signal. And they become less responsive to insulin, which means that you have to make more of it. And then, your insulin levels are going to rise, become hyperinsulinemic. And as you guys talked about on the episode a few weeks ago, that has lots of implications for health. Yeah. So really, by using continuous monitoring for the first time ever, we have the ability to understand glycemic variability, which is a metric that is hugely important to health. It's an independent predictor of poor health outcomes down the road, separate from just a high fasting glucose. And it gives you a lot more granularity into how specific behaviors are affecting glucose in real time that you can then potentially modify.
Yeah, and this is really changing the way that we understand nutritional science too, because we've been looking at things like the glycemic index and the glycemic load for a while to help us understand how certain foods are going to impact our blood sugar. For example, something that's has a high glycemic index is going to spike your blood sugar quickly, but then typically it drops pretty quick. And if it has a high glycemic load, it may not spike it quickly. Something like oatmeal, for example, classic kind of higher glycemic load, where it's not a quick spike, but it's going to keep your blood sugar elevated for a longer period of time and your insulin elevated for a longer period of time. However, what we're realizing here with the continuous blood glucose management, or this tool, is that certain foods are going to react in different ways, right? So it's not really textbook style. We can't just say, okay, this banana is high glycemic, so it's going to spike your blood sugar. People are responding differently. And there may be foods that, normally we would think this is very blood sugar stabilizing, but for you, it's not, right? And your body's going to respond with stress, and it's going to cause a higher amount of blood sugar release and possibly hypoglycemia, reactive hypoglycemia, where your blood sugar drops too low, maybe 2 hours later. So can you explain more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you nailed that. It really, so we are rapidly shifting in terms of our conception of what glycemic index means. Like you mentioned, there has been this paradigm that there's this standard characteristic of a specific food that is like, this is how much this food is going to raise the blood sugar and how quickly in a person. And that's, sort of uniform. But what we're figuring out is that that's actually not true, because our personal response to a specific carbohydrate is going to be very different. And how that carbohydrate translates to glucose in the bloodstream is actually a very complex pathway. And a lot of this research came out of this amazing paper that was published in 2015 in Cell from the Weizmann Institute in Israel, which was called Personalized Nutrition by Prediction of Glycemic Responses. And this paper basically put continuous glucose monitors on tons of healthy, non-diabetic individuals, and then fed them standardized meals. So they all ate the same thing. And they looked at their glucose after those meals. And under the glycemic index paradigm, you would think that every single person would respond, the exact same way to the same food, that everyone eats piece of white bread and their blood glucose all goes up a certain amount and comes down. They're all healthy, it'll all be the same. But that's the opposite of what happened. Basically, what they found is that people could have equal and they could actually, people had a very wide spectrum of their responses to the exact same food. And when you give two people two different foods, they could have equal and opposite reactions to those foods. So you could give someone a banana and a cookie, me and you get a banana and a cookie, I get a banana and a cookie, and I could spike on a cookie and not spike on a banana, and you could do the exact opposite.
Right.
And what's super cool is that they then went further and they said, well, what is the thing that predicts how people are going to respond to these different foods? And some of the key factors were microbiome composition. So they stool sampled everyone multiple times during the study, and they found that composition of microbiome was a predictor of how people would respond. Also things like anthropomorphic features. So really like body type, which makes a lot of sense because we know that certain body types are more associated with insulin resistance. Visceral adiposity and waist to hip ratio is well correlated with level of insulin resistance. So that one makes quite a bit of sense. Basically, that how insulin sensitive you are would have an impact on how you respond. And other things like activity and sleep, like you mentioned, those were also factors as well. So really, what's more likely is that each of us have our own personal glycemic index for every single food based on our own unique physiology. But even upping the complexity a little bit, probably that glycemic index changes day to day based on other factors that are affecting glucose. And it's very sort of modifiable based on other aspects of our health and our behaviors that do impact glucose, because it's not just about food. It's not just about what we put in our mouths. It's also the broader metabolic context. And some of the big factors that we've already touched on are sleep quality, how much stress we have, and then what physical activity we're doing. Those things just translate directly into how we process glucose. So one day you might eat a banana on poor sleep, no exercise, high stress, and have an 80-point glucose spike. The next day you might have 8 hours of sleep, you've done your meditation, you've done your Peloton workout, and you go up 15 points. So that's a different glycemic index for each day. So it's pretty fascinating. And what's awesome is that by wearing a monitor and testing out your favorite foods, and then testing out different permutations of that food, so pairing it with exercise, pairing it with, a meditation session, you can actually start to really build your intuition about what works for you. And then, more broadly, and we can talk about this too, but like what you even do with the food and the context of the food. It's very rare that we eat a food in isolation, which is how the glycemic index works. It's like, 50 grams of whole wheat pasta. This is what happened. It's all based on a 50 gram of, they basically looked at what happened to glucose levels after intake of 50 grams of carbohydrates of a very specific food. But when we pair foods, it also changes our reaction to them. So mixing carbs with protein and fat can change the glycemic index. Usually actually adding protein and fat diminishes and blunts our glucose spike to a food. But again, that's individual. And then the timing of when we eat. So something we eat in the morning will probably cause a smaller glucose spike than something we eat late at night. And so it's just, long story short, it's highly complex. There's a lot of variables impacting our personal glycemic index. And it's really interesting we now can figure it out for ourselves with continuous monitoring and know what's actually really answer for the first time ever. Like this food is healthy for me. This food is the right food for my body. And this is how I should eat it, which is something we've really had to do trial and error on for the rest of history. So yeah, it's an exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's such a great explanation there. And what I found with my wife and I, who have both worn these, is that our blood sugar was really impacted by sleep quality, because we also wear Oura rings to track our sleep. Stress levels were a huge factor. And, I have kind of this guided meditation device called the Brain Tap. When I put that on, it would significantly drop my blood sugar, and I'd feel great, right? Coming out of that, I felt a lot more refreshed and relaxed. So some simple things like that. I mean, those are bigger players than I thought. Just stress, even though I didn't feel stressed, just kind of working intensely was causing higher blood sugar levels. So yeah, it's really great to get that instant feedback and see those types of things, and then be able to make some different modifications, right? Like taking some time to just take some deep breaths, to help get things back under control and reduce the stress hormones. Just plays a really big role.
Absolutely. I think it's such a great point, the sleep and the stress, and their impact on glucose, and realizing that just like really simple behaviors like getting a better night's sleep or doing some breathing can have such an impact on it. And it's quite interesting because really these are, with the stress, for instance, like our body developed adaptive responses to help us in times of stress. And unfortunately, in our modern society, we're almost, these are becoming maladaptive for us. So you think way back when, ancestral times, when really stress was probably more likely a physical or corporeal threat. We had to run from the lion, is the classic example. Who knows if that happened very often, but you're in a physical threat. And in that time of stress, your body releases, cortisol and catecholamine hormones, and it tells the body you got to run. And so your muscles need quick energy, and the quickest form of energy in our body is glucose. And we have little bits of it stored for moments like that it's stored in our liver and our muscles. And our body, when it's stressed, says, okay, dump this from the liver, get it into the bloodstream, get it to the muscles. And so, you often with a high stress experience will see, even in a fasted state, the glucose rise during a stressful event. And that was because our body was trying to help us get the energy it needed to run away from something, really. Now, our threats are generally not physical. We generally don't need to activate our muscles when we're having a stressful conversation or get a stressful email. And so that's really not necessary anymore. And yet that's happening all the time. We have so many low-grade stressors that are just constantly the pings of the phone, the honking of the cars, the emails coming in, the digital stuff that's just constantly sort of getting our cortisol on alert, and we don't need that glucose. So what's happening is that we're kind of chronically elevating our glucose more than it needs to be, and exposing ourselves to all that glucose load just unnecessarily. And it's pretty interesting how that's, with many things, like our modern world is kind of co-opting our evolutionary advantages and turning them against us. And we have to sort of rise above that to get, on top of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really interested in what you guys are doing with Levels Health, because you guys have created a metabolic score, right? Can you explain more about that? Because it's one thing the continuous blood glucose monitor you can get from Freestyle Libre, that's probably the most popular brand, I would imagine. They've got an app that you can watch your blood sugar and how it's going, but it's another thing, the more in-depth analysis that you guys are doing really helps somebody understand how they're responding to the foods and the environment that they're in. Can you explain more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are continuous glucose monitors, on the market, and these have been around for over a decade. They're FDA-approved devices that are for the management of type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So these have been a game changer for the diabetic population, because instead of having to prick your finger 3, 4, or 5 times a day, you can see your glucose all day long. And so these devices, they eliminate the finger pricks, and they're amazing. But as we know, more and more about metabolic health and how it is so important for us to really stay on top of this earlier rather than later. These are, diabetes, type 2 diabetes is a largely preventable condition. So having insight into our metabolic health far earlier is really the time to get on top of it. Stay low and flat with your glucose throughout your life, and, never have to walk into the doctor's office and say, here's a surprise. Where you're at on that metabolic spectrum, and can, continuously work to improve. But these devices were really never meant to be behavior change tools. They weren't meant to guide us to really what the right behaviors are. And as we've talked about, there's a lot of complexity to it. There's many input variables that can affect glucose, from, the nature of our meals, what we're pairing them with, when we're timing them, and then all the other lifestyle factors. And so just having the raw glucose data stream isn't necessarily going to push us to really intuit what we need to do to make changes. Yeah. And so that's where the company that I've co-founded, Levels, that's where we're really trying to fill that need, to make understanding this glucose data stream super intuitive, and to help people develop their metabolic intuition and get excited about how to move the needle on a lot of these different modifiable aspects of glucose control. And so that's the software that we've developed, and really trying to get this mainstream and people to think about it similar to they think about their other health tracking tools. We all are these days wearing the Oura, the Fitbit, the Whoop. People have their smart beds, the 8 Sleep. We're tracking HRV with Oura and HeartMath and Leaf Therapeutics. These companies are amazing because what they're doing is they're tapping into a continuous data stream with then an overlay to motivate you, to make it social, to give you insight into the variables of how you can change it. Whoop and Oura will tell you what to do to get your sleep better, to get your HRV better. And this is just where there's a vacuum and a void around glucose. We don't have that. So that's what we've created. And we know that we're dealing with a metabolic health epidemic in our country. Like I mentioned, 88% of people with a sign of metabolic dysfunction and 128 million Americans with diabetes or prediabetes. That's like a third of the country, and 74% of Americans overweight or obese. So this is monumental. And, to really move the needle on those crises, it's coming down to consistent day in and day out personalized behaviors and that are right for your body, that move the needle on health. And so that's where I think digital health and software is really going, is to help people understand their body, make the choices, and then do them consistently. And that's what we're doing for glucose. And that's what Level software is.
Yeah, absolutely. And basically you guys have an analysis system, like an algorithm that based on what the person ate and how their blood sugar responded to that scores it from 0 to 10 as well, which makes it really easy for the user, because user doesn't really understand necessarily, it's like you got to really micromanage how that blood sugar responded, and it can be tough to analyze. But when you get a score, I think all of us understands kind of that gamification, and we all understand scoring, right, from school and just our upbringing. So I think that really helps us understand how we're responding to the foods that we're eating and the environment that we're in too.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really what our goal has been, is to make this as simple as possible for people. And so that really has driven some of our new metrics that we're adding. So right now, like if you just walk into the doctor, they'll say your fasting glucose is 98 or your fasting glucose is 115. It's hard to know exactly what that means. And what does it mean if your glucose goes to 130 after a meal? Well, the beauty is the scientific literature tells us a lot about the implications of these fluctuations, but that's, thousands of pages of papers that, we're not going to be thinking, about that every time we take a bite. And so our goal is really to condense it into a 1 to 10 score that when you sit down and eat a meal, like 2 hours later, you have a grade essentially for that. Was it an A? Was it a B? And that's taking into account a number of aspects of what happened to your glucose curve after the meal that we know are associated with better or worse health outcomes. So there's a lot of different things you can learn from just that little curve that happens after a meal. So some of the things that you can look at that actually tell us something about metabolic health is how high the spike went. So like the peak and the delta from baseline. Where did you start? Where did you go? The second thing is, how long did it take to come down? Did you go straight up and straight down, or did you go up and you stay elevated for a while? How spiky were you coming down? Was it kind of like, you were jumping like a yo-yo as you were coming down, or was it just sort of a very smooth curve? Even how long it takes you to get to the peak after a meal makes a difference. Right. All of these things have been sort of looked at as proxies of our overall metabolic health. So in creating our scoring systems, we take into account those things and really do analytics on that curve to give people just this very simple grade. And so, 10 is an A+, essentially. 0 is not good. And we really want to encourage people to stick with 7, 8s, 9s, and 10s. That would be sort of like the passing grade and what, sort of the green zone. And I've been fascinated by seeing our users, these simple scoring also really lends to people being able to share this information and be excited about it. Like, I got a 10. I had a day of straight 10s, and people love sharing that on social and seeing that. So it is very cool to see sort of this community element arise around a biomarker that never has really been one that we've seen tracked before. People love to share about steps and their sleep data, but now there's this new biomarker that we can really rally around and support each other and have community around. So that's the meal score. And that's really that 0 to 10. And then you also mentioned the metabolic fitness score. This is a more, a longer term metric that like grades your day. So how are you doing overall? And so that when you look at the full 24-hour period, we can capture a lot of additional sort of interesting data points from the curve. So what is your baseline glucose? i.e., when you go up and come down after a meal, where do you sort of rest during the day, your basal level? And then what is your glucose first thing in the morning, more of your fasting glucose? How much does your glucose rise first in the morning, right when you wake up? There's a phenomenon called the dawn effect, which is where when we wake up from rest, we get a cortisol surge to help us get out of bed. And that's tradition. It's sort of a stress signal, but what it's doing is helping our body mobilize to get up out of bed. And that can cause a little bit of a glucose rise. So we can look at that and how much you're rising in the morning from cortisol. What is your overnight levels? So you can take all of that into account and kind of give a more composite picture of the whole day and sort of so where you're at on that spectrum. And that's the metabolic fitness score. So those are two things that we've developed to just help make it easier for people to understand what's happening with their choices and hopefully move to make, choices that get their scores up.
Yeah, and I think it really does too, because I think we're naturally wired to want some level of reward. And food gives us an instant reward. We eat food we enjoy, we get a dopamine spike, we feel great, right? It just feels good. We don't really realize the impact it might be having on our body. But when we're able to look at this and kind of be able to see what our score is, like our meal score and whatnot, now it gives us extra incentive because we're going to get another dopamine hit when we have a good score, right? And so we have that sort of accountability and instant feedback that we're able to get that is going to make us, it's going to give us more instant reward for making good choices. Like, you don't think about weight gain in one meal, right? Or weight loss through one meal, those are things that happen over time. Same with your energy, same with, all of these other elements of how we feel. These are more long, they're more consistent lifestyle habits over time, but by able to get like an immediate impact score like that, I think that's going to really help incentivize people. So I know certainly for myself, I'm wired like that, where I like to have some level of immediate score to let me know, okay, I did good here. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think this comes down to the concept of closed loop biofeedback, which is extremely effective for behavior change. And that's really the founding principle of this company, is that when there is a lag time between what you do and what the result is, it is much harder to then change that behavior, because it is very easy to misattribute the action to the reaction, or misattribute the reaction to the action if there's a longer time period. Right. A lot more variables come into play. So the tighter you can make that, the better in terms of behavior change. And nutrition has been notorious for having open loop feedback and high variability and complexity in understanding the relationship between the choice you're making and what's happening. Traditionally, what we've had is one, stepping on the scale the next morning. You get on the scale and you're like, okay, well, I'm 2 pounds heavier. Is this water weight? Is this my hormones? Is this the cake I had at 2 p.m. yesterday? Like, what is this? So that's very challenging to look back and say, like, what can I do differently? It's sort of like, well, do everything differently, but you just don't know. The second one we've had is that yearly fasting glucose test at the doctor's office with your annual physical. And so last year, fasting glucose was 87. This year it's 89. What does that mean? It really means nothing. And so it doesn't help you actually change things. Your doctor might say, oh, your fasting glucose has gone up a little bit. Like, I'd watch your diet. I'd try and exercise more, but that is essentially ineffective. And so, and then of course we also have our subjective feeling. So you could have a meal and you could really tap into how you're feeling after a meal. And I think that's wonderful. That's essentially somatic awareness. And I'm a huge proponent of that in terms of, knowing how something's affecting us. But that is also a tough one, because do we really know if our glucose is, spiking after a meal? I think you can get to the point where you do actually have a sense of that. But I think the biofeedback with the CGM helps you gain that type of somatic awareness. So this is a term that I think there's a term called interoception, which I think is really relevant to continuous glucose monitoring. And interoception is similar to the concept of somatic awareness, but it's basically an understanding of something that's going on inside your body, like a quantifiable metric, and being able to have an awareness of it. So you can think about heartbeat. People who have good heartbeat interoception are people who can like sit quietly and just say like, this is how fast my heart is beating, and they can thump it on the table. There's other people who have no awareness of how fast their heart is beating. And interestingly, people who do have more interoception about something like heart rate have lower rates of anxiety and depression. They have better cardiovascular outcomes. There's something about being able to hear what's happening inside your body that is good for health. I think we all intuitively know this, but in our current modern world, it is so much harder to hear our internal body signals. We've got a lot of distractions. We're very screen facing, we're on the go, we're tired, we're staying up late. We're also exposed to these crazy hyperpalatable foods that are basically frankenfoods. They're not real, and they hijack our normal reward circuitry. So we don't really know how we're feeling, because we feel we're getting like essentially a drug surge when we get sugar, and processed and refined food. So the idea of really true body awareness is challenging. And when you pair a tool like a biofeedback tool, whether it's heart rate or glucose, you can actually improve your interoception capabilities. So when they put heart rate training on people, they take people and they give them a heart rate tracker and they help them see it and understand their heart rate. They become better at their interoception. And I think that actually happens as well with glucose. As I've tracked my own glucose, I've been wearing a continuous glucose monitor for a year now. I am very sensitive now to what is happening inside my body, even if I don't look at my glucose. I know when my glucose is going up. I know when it's going down, and I can just feel it. But that's because I've had so many instances of this trifecta of an action, seeing the data, and feeling the subjective experience. And now I can just triangulate those three things naturally. And our CEO, Sam, his biggest experience with this was he put on a CGM and he had his normal breakfast, which was oatmeal. And he didn't check his glucose for a while, but he had a big bowl of oatmeal, which he's always been told is like a heart healthy food. It's a whole grain, And later in the morning, and he also had some coffee. And later in the morning, he felt his normal, early afternoon, like late morning, early afternoon kind of energy slump, kind of felt tired, kind of felt a little moody. And he checked his glucose and he looked back at his data, and it turned out he'd spiked to 200, which is super high. And then it crashed down to like 60. So he had a huge hyperglycemic spike and then a hypoglycemic episode. And the reason that happens is because when you have a big glucose spike like that, your body throws the insulin on that and you soak up so much glucose that you end up overshooting and dipping. Yeah. And that can lead to anxiety, low energy. So he's like, oh my God, like I've been always attributing this like morning slump to sleep quality or maybe my caffeine, but like I'm going on a glucose roller coaster. And so basically for the past year, Sam's been eating like avocado and scrambled eggs for breakfast, has zero glucose spike with that. And like, it's totally revolutionized his mornings. And this misattribution that we so often do when we don't have closed loop biofeedback is instantly gone. And what's also interesting about that is that when you can create that trifecta of awareness, of action, metric biofeedback, and subjective experience, it also becomes much less painful to part with things in your life. Like if you loved oatmeal, once you see that, it's so clear, it's so obvious that it's not like upsetting to like say, I'm not gonna, eat this anymore. I'm gonna eat it differently to have a better outcome, because you have understanding. And it's so much of, I think, the difficulty with dieting and with adopting quote unquote healthy diets or other behaviors is that we don't actually know if they're working or doing something. There's such a lag time between whether we actually have the outcome we want on, the scale or our cholesterol test or our fasting glucose test, that it's ultimately very challenging to adopt these behaviors. But when you can just like see the instant response, it's a lot easier to sort of part. And I kind of I liken this to food poisoning. Like when you eat clams and you have food poisoning, like you never want to eat a clam again. It's not like you're sad to give up clams. You're just like, oh, of course I would never eat them again because I don't want this to happen again. It's a similar unemotional feeling, I think, when you have the glucose data. So
yeah, immediate feedback, closed loop biofeedback, like you talked about. Yeah, so important. So how close are we to being able to make these continuous blood glucose monitors affordable for people to be utilizing all the time? Because I know, really up until very recent, the only way to get it is a medical prescription. I believe that's still the case, right? And then on top of that, they're very expensive, especially if you don't have insurance. And I believe insurance is only going to cover it if you have diabetes or type 1 or type 2. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So these devices are still prescription only in the United States. Most of them are actually over the counter in almost every other country in the world, which makes a lot of sense because we can also walk into the pharmacy and buy a finger stick glucose monitor. So you can kind of create your own continuous glucose monitor by just pricking your finger, 50 times a day.
Did you say that only in the United States they're prescription?
There may be some other countries, but in the majority of other countries, they're over the counter.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah. So here, like with our company, we have the software, but we've also have a telemedicine network that's evaluating people for these prescription devices. And then we fulfill them through a partner pharmacy because it is difficult to go into your primary care doctor's office and say, hey, I want this device. A lot of people aren't primed yet to really be thinking about glucose for the non-diabetic use case because we're so trained to think about glucose only in the context of diabetes, of this really late stage manifestation. So that's one of the things we wanted to help with was access. But you're right, they are very expensive. And I think that price point is going to come down rapidly over the next few years for a couple of reasons. One, there's a lot more interest in this non-diabetic market, and I think the demand is going to grow, and that's going to change the economics of it. There's also many hardware companies coming down the pipeline, creating new types of glucose sensing technologies. There's some really cool things, and so the hardware is rapidly advancing, and I think we're going to see a lot more FDA approved players on the market, and that's going to bring the price point down too. And so yeah, I think it's going to be a very exciting next couple of years in terms of glucose.
Yeah, for sure. What is a typical price range now for continuous blood glucose monitor?
Yeah. So like you mentioned, they are currently only covered for people with type 1 or type 2 diabetes by insurance. And even in that world, I've heard from many diabetic individuals that even getting access to the sensors is somewhat difficult through insurance, which is always a surprise to me because from a cost saving standpoint of helping people manage their disease and manage their medications more effectively, these are proven to have just superior efficacy to finger sticks. So I'm hoping that will change, just general coverage and access for the diabetic population. And if you're just buying it out of pocket, they range from about $60 to $100 per device, and each device lasts on the arm for 14 days. And I'm talking specifically about the Abbott Freestyle Libre, which is one of the most commonly prescribed versions. So it's just a little quarter that's disposable that sticks on the back of your arm, and you throw it away after 14 days. And those range from about 60 to 100. And the reason I say it ranges is because every pharmacy you walk into to get these, it's going to have a slightly different price, which again is just a strange function of our healthcare economics in this country. But I think that price point's going to get down quite a bit in the coming years.
Yeah, and I think you guys are really leading the way in that, making it a lot easier for people to access. And people can go to levelshealth.com. And are you guys still in beta testing, or are you now working with the general public?
Yeah, we are in beta testing right now. So we have had about 1,000 people go through our program, and we are planning for a full launch at the end of 2020, where you can just come to the website and sign up.
Great. So is there like a waiting list right now that people can get on?
There is. Yeah, there's a waiting list. So what I would recommend is if people are interested to come to www.levelshealth.com, and you can sign up for the wait list, which will keep you in the loop of when we have access available. And then it'll also get you on the newsletter. And me and a team of other physicians and PhD experts are writing voraciously on the Levels blog about these topics and about glucose really targeted towards the non-diabetic individual, how glucose relates to athletic performance, fitness, endurance, general health now, prevention of future disease, just some really, really interesting topics there, personalized nutrition. So yeah, definitely recommend that if people want to learn more.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend it for our listeners. I mean, it's pretty easy to go out and spend a few $100s to get a lab test done. Most really good lab tests are going to cost you a few $100s. So you can use that same money and do a month on, a Freestyle Libre, utilizing your guys' system to really be able to check your metabolic score and get that biofeedback. So you really learn a lot about how your body's responding to things. And then if you did that like for 1 month out of a year, and then started practicing that throughout the year, I think it would be, just a great way to improve your health and give you that feedback that you want that you really can't test, with standard blood work. So I would recommend that.
Thank you so much. Yeah. We'd be happy to hear from anyone who wants to learn more. So
yeah, for sure. And then last question, how close do you think we are to getting a continuous insulin measurement? I would love that.
Oh, it's my dream. Yeah. It's a much harder molecule to test.
Yeah.
Glucose is so simple with the glucose oxidase reaction, and insulin is a large protein, and no one's cracked this code yet. Many people have tried, and I think we are many, many years out from seeing that, although I think it would be absolutely game-changing for health. The good thing is that glucose is a close proxy to insulin in most people. And I do think, getting a fasting continuous insulin monitoring would be amazing. But I think working with a functional medicine doctor, or if your, normal primary care doctor is open to doing it, like I would just implore anyone listening to ask for that fasting glucose test and just, and see. That's just such a great way to understand sort of what the last 10 years of, your lifestyle have been kind of doing to your overall metabolic health. Because, if you're between less than 6, 2 and 5, 6, like really awesome, your insulin is low, you're probably not dealing with much insulin resistance. 6 to 20, you're starting to see some movement of your insulin kind of creeping up at baseline, probably because it's been, a lot of spikes for years and years and years. Your cells have been exposed to lots of insulin and had to kind of get the baseline up there. And then above that, above 20 or more, probably dealing with some more severe, potentially insulin resistance. So those are sort of generalities. And I think everyone has a different range because these ranges for insulin have not been standardized yet, but it kind of gives you a sense of like the long-term view. But what's cool is that with using a sensor, like a continuous glucose monitor, basically the way you can think about how it affects your insulin is that if you can keep those spikes minimized day after day, essentially like you're going to the gym, it's instead of going to the gym and working your regular fitness, you're working your metabolic fitness. And the thing we're doing there is keeping glucose spikes lower. Yeah. You can imagine you're keeping your insulin lower each day. Right. And every day you're keeping your insulin lower, your cells they wake up again to that insulin signal and become more insulin sensitive. And then your pancreas can turn down its, faucet of insulin. And so basically each day you're using that CGM to keep the spikes down. You can assume that you're keeping that insulin exposure lower, letting your cells wake up, become more insulin responsive, giving your pancreas a break. And over time, what would you expect is that the next time you get your fasting insulin checked, it'd be a lot lower. Yeah. So that's kind of the big picture. I know, but just to kind of paint the picture for everyone.
Yeah, listening. But I think that is so important because I've seen a lot of people with hemoglobin A1Cs that were very healthy, yet they had weight loss resistance. They couldn't lose weight, inflammation in their body. And then when we test fasting insulin's 12, but their hemoglobin A1C is 5.0. So their blood sugar is staying down, but they're producing a lot of insulin in order to do that. And they're most likely having a lot of little spikes in that range. And so the continuous blood glucose monitoring can really help with that.
Well, in a resilient body, the pancreas can do a whole lot of work to force the glucose to be in a specific level before we sort of that process breaks and we start to see that fasting glucose or that A1C going up. So a lot of people say, and I think Ben Beckman says this in his book or maybe on some podcasts I've heard, but that insulin is probably elevated predating glucose elevations by like 10 years.
Yeah.
You know, because we're just compensating and forcing that glucose into the cells, keeping the glucose somewhat stable appearing on our yearly lab tests by just producing more insulin. So it's a great test, and we can move that whole ship in the right direction by improving our insulin sensitivity by keeping our glucose lower. So it's an exciting time that like we're able to kind of put some of these pieces together, even though the technology and the tests aren't, you know, there's still going to be a lot of progress down the road. Like you said, continuous insulin monitors, continuous inflammation monitors, all this stuff, but we can certainly triangulate the issue pretty much better now than we could, 5 years ago. So.
Well, it's been such a fascinating conversation, and I just want to really acknowledge you guys for all the great work that you're doing. And Dr. Casey, you're a great spokesperson for the company. You really have a great elegant and sophisticated way of explaining all these topics. And I know I learned a lot listening to this, and I know our listeners have gotten a lot of value out of it as well. So thanks again for your time. And you guys can check out levelshealth.com. We'll have a link, of course, in the show notes. But check that out. And I know Dr. Casey's been doing a lot of podcast interviews. So anytime you see her out there, make sure you download and listen to her podcasts and interviews, because she's on the ball with this and really is a pioneer in leading the way to get this testing out to more people. So thanks again, Dr. Casey.
Thank you so much.
All right. And so for those of you listeners, definitely leave us a review and any sort of feedback you have on this. And we'll see you guys on a future podcast.